To the world, he was a soul legend who generated millions. To the fire, he was just a helpless addict with empty pockets. Steve Marriott spent 40 years burning bright, only to be extinguished in a dark, clutter-filled room. The industry stole his wealth, but the addiction stole his survival instinct. The pills he took to escape the pain of life became the chains that bound him to a burning floor. He died a prisoner of the very chemicals he used to feel free. Steve Marriott was born into the gray survivalism of 1947 London. Barely 5 feet tall, he had a Napoleonic complex hardwired into his DNA. He realized early that if he couldn't tower over people physically, he would overwhelm them with noise. His entry into showbiz was as the Artful Dodger in Oliver, a role that was less of a performance and more of a biography. But the theater was too disciplined for his chaotic energy. He found his true conduit in American vinyl. Listening to Ray Charles and Otis Redding, he discovered a physical contradiction. A skinny, malnourished white boy from East London producing the raw sandpaper tear of the American South. He didn't just sing notes, he attacked them until they screamed. By 1965, Steve was the face of the Mod movement, a religion of sharp suits and working-class overcompensation. To fuel this obsession, he turned to drinamyl, known as Purple Hearts. For a hyperactive personality like Marriott, speed wasn't a party drug. It was a normalization agent. It kept him sharp and invincible, rewiring his metabolism before he was 20. The fatal cycle of manic highs and crushing lows was established here, long before the fire. He met Ronnie Lane at the Ruskin Arms Hotel. Lane was the bass player, the soul to Marriott's fire, together with Kenny Jones and Jimmy Winston. Later replaced by Ian McClagan, they formed the Small Faces. The name was a literal description. They were all small, and they were all faces, top mods in the hierarchy of cool. But they were not a boy band manufactured in a boardroom. They were a street gang with instruments. Their rise was meteoric and violent. They didn't just play gigs, they incited riots. The energy Steve projected from the stage was frightening. The veins in his neck would bulge, sweat flying, eyes wide and manic, screaming all or nothing, with a desperation that terrified and thrilled the audience. He was a conductor of electricity. But behind the scenes, the exploitation had already begun. They signed with Don Arden, a man whose reputation in the music industry was akin to a mob boss. Arden didn't manage careers. He owned people. He saw the Small Faces not as artists, but as a cash machine. The band generated millions. They had hit after hit, Sha-la-la-la-lee, Hey Girl, My Mind's Eye. They were on top of the pops constantly. To the public, they were rich, young gods driving Mini Coopers and living the high life. The reality was a grim farce. The contrast was sickeningly visual. When All or Nothing hit #1 in the charts, the band didn't celebrate with champagne and caviar. They sat in a greasy spoon cafe, eating pie and mash, the cheapest working-class meal available, because they didn't have the cash for anything else. Meanwhile, outside the window, their manager, Don Arden, pulled up in a gleaming white Rolls-Royce bought with their royalties. When they dared to question him, Arden didn't just waive a contract. He leaned in with a threat that belonged in a gangster movie. He didn't just threaten their careers. He explicitly threatened to hang their parents out of a window if they tried to leave. It wasn't just a business dispute. It was a hostage situation. The band members were given a weekly wage that was barely enough to buy clothes and food. They were living in a shared house on Westmoreland Terrace, sleeping on mattresses on the floor, while Arden bought mansions. Steve Marriott was the voice of a generation, yet he had to ask permission to buy a guitar string. This financial emasculation planted a seed of bitterness in Steve that would grow into a forest of resentment. He knew he was being robbed. He knew his talent was generating the wealth that others were enjoying, But he was young, naive, and kept distracted by the relentless schedule of touring and recording. The industry kept them moving so fast they didn't have time to check the books. They were fed pills to keep working and alcohol to come down. They were worked like pit ponies in a coal mine, extracting hits from the dark seams of their creativity until they were exhausted. Musically, Steve was evolving faster than the industry allowed. He wanted respect. He wanted to be taken seriously as a musician, not just a pop star for screaming teenage girls. He wrote Itchy Coo Park, a psychedelic masterpiece that utilized flanging effects and complex production techniques. It was a hit, but it was still seen as pop. But just as success was within reach, the door slammed shut. Just as Itchy Coo Park was climbing the charts in America, becoming the anthem of the summer, the band was grounded. Ian McLagan had been busted for drug possession, and the U.S. authorities slammed the door shut. While their song played on every radio station from New York to L.A., the band was stuck in London, watching their own success on a television screen in a pub, unable to cross the ocean to claim it. It was the first sign of a curse that would haunt Steve. The door to the next level was always open, but he was never allowed to walk through it. The scream was becoming a cage. He felt trapped by his own image. He was the face, the cute one, the mod icon. But inside he heard a heavier sound. He heard the blues. He heard the sludge and the dirt of the Delta. He wanted to play music that hurt. The breaking point was not a sudden snap, but a slow grinding of gears. By 1968, the summer of love was turning sour. The drugs were changing. The innocent pep of amphetamines was giving way to heavier substances. The camaraderie of the band was fraying under the pressure of poverty and fame. Steve looked at his peers, Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck. They were playing heavy blues. They were respected as virtuosos. They were making real money. He felt he was being left behind in the nursery while the adults were playing in the living room. He tried to push the small faces in a heavier direction. He brought in Peter Frampton, a guitarist with a face of his own, but a melodic sensibility that intrigued Steve to join the band. The others resisted. Ronnie Lane, the heart of the band, felt Steve was trying to hijack their identity. The tension in the studio became suffocating. Steve Marriott, the man who needed absolute control because he felt he had none, could not tolerate the resistance. The Napoleonic complex flared. If he couldn't lead the army, he would burn the barracks. On New Year's Eve, 1968, at a gig at the Alexandra Palace, the structure finally collapsed. Steve walked off stage. He didn't just quit the gig, he quit the life. He left the small faces, the band that had defined him, the band that was his family. It was an act of self-sabotage that would become a recurring theme in his life. Whenever he reached a peak, whenever stability was within reach, he would pull the pin on the grenade. He destroyed the small faces to build something else, something louder, something that would finally earn him the respect he craved. He called Peter Frampton. He called Greg Ridley from Spooky Tooth. He called Jerry Shirley, a teenage drumming prodigy. He named the new project Humble Pie. The name was a joke, a cynical nod to the fact that the critics had savaged him for leaving the small faces. He claimed he wanted to be humble, to be just a member of a band, not the star. But this was a lie he told himself. Steve Marriott could never be just a member. He was a force of nature who dominated every space he entered. The transition to Humble Pie was the beginning of the hard road. It was a rejection of the sharp suits and the pop hits. He grew his hair. He stopped shaving. He wore denim. He wanted to look like the music sounded, rough, dirty, authentic. He was shedding the skin of the mod to reveal the rocker underneath, but in doing so, he was also shedding the discipline that had kept him somewhat grounded. The small faces had been a unit, a brotherhood that kept each other in check. Humble pie was a vehicle for his ambition, and soon a vehicle for his excesses. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, Steve Marriott was a man on a mission to prove the world wrong. He wanted to conquer America. He wanted to show Don Arden and the British press that he didn't need them. He was fueled by revenge and insecurity, two of the most potent propellants for a rock star, but he was carrying baggage that he hadn't unpacked. The financial trauma of the small faces era meant he was terrified of being broke, yet he had no concept of how to manage money. The chemical dependency on speed was now being supplemented by cocaine, a drug that amplified his ego and his paranoia in equal measure. He was entering the new decade as a coiled spring, vibrating with potential energy and latent violence. He had the voice, he had the band, he had the hunger, but he was walking onto a battlefield without armor. The industry was about to change from a cottage industry of sharks like Don Arden to a corporate machine of multinational conglomerates. Steve Marriott, the street fighter from East London, thought he knew how to fight. He didn't know that the war had changed rules. He was bringing a switchblade to a nuclear exchange. The fire that would kill him 20 years later was not yet lit, but the kindling was being stacked. The isolation of the road, the reliance on chemical regulation of his mood, the deep-seated inability to trust the people handling his business. These were the wooden beams of the cottage, drying out, waiting for the spark. He was about to achieve everything he ever wanted, and it would be the worst thing that could possibly happen to him. America was not a country. It was a continent of empty space waiting to be filled with noise. And Steve Marriott arrived in 1969 determined to fill every inch of it. The transition from the polite tea-drinking pop scene of London to the concrete and steel grind of the American touring circuit was a shock to the system that would have broken a lesser man. For Marriott, it was an invitation to war. He viewed the United States as a hostile entity that needed to be subdued, city by city, gig by gig. The strategy was simple: brute force. Humble Pie was no longer a band. It was a heavy artillery unit. The early tours were a logistical nightmare. They were crammed into the back of vans, driving hundreds of miles between dates, sleeping in motels that smelled of stale smoke and desperation. This was the toilet circuit, the unglamorous underbelly of the rock and roll dream. But it was here, in the sweat-drenched clubs of Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago, that Steve Marriott forged his new identity. He stripped away the mod affectations. The sharp suits were replaced by denim vests and scarves. The neat haircut grew into a wild mane. He wasn't trying to be pretty anymore. He was trying to be undeniable. The chemistry of Humble Pie was volatile. On one side was Peter Frampton, the face of 1968, a guitarist with a melodic, almost jazz-like sensibility. He wanted to play music that was intricate and beautiful. On the other side was Steve, a man who treated the microphone stand like a weapon and the audience like an enemy combatant. Steve didn't want beauty. He wanted impact. He wanted the music to hit the chest like a physical blow. This tension was the engine of the band. Frampton provided the structure, the scaffolding of the songs, and Marriott poured concrete over it. Their breakthrough wasn't immediate. Their first two albums, As Safe as Yesterday Is and Town and Country, were eclectic, confusing mixes of acoustic folk and heavy rock. The American audience, weaned on the thunder of Led Zeppelin and Grand Funk Railroad, didn't know what to make of them. They wanted boogie. They wanted heaviness. Steve, with his uncanny ability to read a room, sensed this. He realized that in the massive arenas of America, subtlety was a liability. You couldn't be intricate when you were playing to 20,000 stoned kids in a hockey rink with bad acoustics. You had to be loud. You had to be simple. He began to push the band into a harder, darker direction. The blues influences became more pronounced, but they were mutated, sped up, and amplified. Steve's voice changed. The soulful rasp of the Small Faces era deepened into a guttural roar. He wasn't singing from his diaphragm anymore. He was singing from his knees, using his entire body to expel the sound. It was a vocal technique that was medically unsustainable. He was shredding his vocal cords every night, relying on adrenaline and alcohol to numb the pain, sacrificing his body to achieve that signature sound, a raw mix of pain and power. The turning point came in 1971 with the recording of Performance Rockin' the Fillmore. This live album is the forensic evidence of Humble Pie at their absolute peak. Recorded over 4 shows at the Fillmore East in New York City, it captures a band operating at a level of ferocity that frightened their peers. The Fillmore was the cathedral of rock, run by Bill Graham, a man who demanded excellence. Steve Marriott walked onto that stage and owned it. The recording of I Don't Need No Doctor is not a song, it is a riot. The groove is relentless, a steamroller of rhythm laid down by Greg Ridley and Jerry Shirley. But riding on top of it is Steve. He is a man possessed. He banters with the crowd. He screams, he whispers, he preaches. He commands the audience to clap, and you can hear the obedience in the recording. He was a dictator of the stage. He controlled the energy of 3,000 people with a wave of his hand. When he hits the high notes, it sounds like metal shearing. It is the sound of a man giving absolutely everything, holding nothing back for the next night, spending his entire life force in a single hour. Rockin' the Fillmore went gold. It made them superstars. It validated Steve's aggressive strategy, but it also killed the original lineup. Peter Frampton looked at the monster they had created and realized there was no place for him in it. The volume was too high. The aggression was too intense. The subtle guitar lines he wanted to play were being buried under the avalanche of Steve's ego and the band's increasing heaviness. Frampton quit. To Steve, this was a betrayal, but also a liberation. He was now the undisputed captain of the ship. He replaced Frampton with Clem Clemson, a guitarist who was happy to play the heavy, bluesy riffs that Steve demanded. The band became Steve Marriott and the Humble Pie. The democracy was over. The dictatorship had begun. This shift in power coincided with a shift in management. They had escaped the clutches of Don Arden only to fall into the arms of D. Anthony. Anthony was an American manager of the old school, cigar-chomping, tough-talking, and utterly ruthless. He looked at Steve Marriott and saw a gold mine. He saw a performer who would work until he dropped. Anthony's philosophy was simple: keep them on the road. Tour until the wheels fall off. If they aren't playing, they aren't earning. The schedule became inhumane. They were doing 300 dates a year. They were crisscrossing America in a private plane, a luxury that was actually a prison. The isolation of the touring lifestyle began to rot Steve from the inside. He was surrounded by people, roadies, groupies, hangers-on, but he was profoundly alone. He couldn't trust the people who paid him. He couldn't trust the people who claimed to love him. The only place he felt safe was on stage, in the eye of the storm. To maintain this crushing pace, the chemical intake escalated. The mod speed of the 60s was replaced by the rock star fuel of the 70s, cocaine. Cocaine was the perfect drug for the D. Anthony business model. It kept you awake. It kept you confident. It allowed you to play 2 shows a night, drive 500 miles, do interviews, and do it all again the next day. But it also fed Steve's paranoia. It amplified his Napoleonic complex. It made him aggressive, irrational, and volatile. The recording of the album Smokin' in 1972 was the zenith of this chemical creativity. The album was a massive hit, driven by the anthem 30 Days in the Hole. The lyrics were a celebration of the drug culture, a thumb in the eye to the law. Red Lebanese, black Nepalese. Steve was cataloging the substances that were now ruling his life. The music was swampy, heavy, and undeniable. It was the sound of a band that was sweating whiskey and bleeding cocaine. But behind the platinum records, the finances were a black hole. D. Anthony was a master of creative accounting. The band was generating millions of dollars in ticket sales and merchandise. They were selling out stadiums. Yet Steve Marriott often found himself asking for cash advances. The money went into the company, into expenses, into overheads that were never explained. Steve was given a generous allowance, enough to buy cars and drugs and clothes, to keep him distracted. He was living like a king, but he was a king in a rented castle. He owned nothing. The rights to his songs, the publishing, the master tapes, they were all tied up in labyrinthine contracts that he was too stoned or too busy to read. The bitterness that had started with the small faces began to curdle into a deep, toxic cynicism. Steve knew he was being used. He referred to the industry as the swamp. He saw himself as a gladiator thrown into the arena to bleed for the amusement of the mob and the profit of the emperor. This cynicism bled into the music. The joy of performance began to look like desperation. The banter with the audience became aggressive, sometimes hostile. He would scream at crowds if they didn't react the way he wanted. He would stop songs if the sound wasn't right. He was a perfectionist, losing control of his environment, trying to enforce order through volume and rage. By 1973, the cracks were visible to anyone who looked closely. The album Eat It was a bloated double LP mess that showed a band running out of ideas. Steve was trying to introduce female backing singers, the Blackberries, trying to turn Humble Pie into a soul review. It was a bold artistic move, a return to his R&B roots, but the heavy metal audience didn't get it. They wanted the boogie. They wanted the noise. Steve was trapped in the monster he had built. He couldn't evolve because the market demanded the caricature. His personal life was a mirror of his professional chaos. He bought a mansion in England, Beehive Cottage, a sprawling estate that he filled with expensive toys, dogs, and an entourage of sycophants. It was a fortress against the world, but it was also a madhouse. The drug use at Beehive Cottage was legendary. It wasn't recreational. It was industrial. Steve was consuming cocaine by the ounce. His behavior became erratic. He would stay awake for days, dismantling electronics, rewriting songs, ranting about conspiracies. He was a man running at 100 miles per hour with the brakes cut. The terrifying thing was that his voice didn't fail. Even as his body withered, even as his mind frayed, the voice remained. It was a biological miracle. He could smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day, drink a bottle of brandy, snort gram after gram of coke, and still walk out on stage and hit a high C that would shatter glass. This resilience was his undoing. Because he could still perform, nobody intervened. As long as the golden goose could still lay the egg, nobody cared that the goose was dying. The Thunderbox tour of 1974 was a grim march. The venues were getting slightly smaller. The reviews were getting scathing. The critics called them dinosaurs, relics of a boogie era that was being replaced by the sleek sounds of disco or the art rock of Bowie. Steve hated the trends. He hated the fashion. He retreated further into his blues obsession, convinced that if he just played harder, if he just screamed louder, he could turn the tide. But the audience was changing. The kids who had worshipped him in 1971 were growing up. They were moving on. Steve Marriott was standing still, screaming into a hurricane that was slowly blowing him away. The king of the Fillmore was starting to look like a man out of time. He was 27 years old, the age when Hendrix, Joplin, and Morrison had died. Steve didn't die, but something inside him began to atrophy. The spark of joy, the mischievous wink of the artful dodger was being extinguished. In its place was a hard, cold stare of a man who realized he was trapped on a treadmill that was moving too fast to step off. He began to sabotage the band. He would show up late. He would pick fights with promoters. He was subconsciously trying to destroy the machine that was eating him. He wanted out, but he didn't know how to leave. He had no other skills. He had been a performer since he was 12. If he wasn't Steve Marriott, the screamer, who was he? He was a terrifying question mark. The collapse of Humble Pie was not an explosion, but a slow deflation. By 1975, the Street Rats album was a disjointed collection of songs that sounded like they were recorded by strangers in different rooms. The band was finished. They played a final lackluster tour, a goodbye tour that felt less like a celebration and more like a funeral procession. When it ended, Steve walked away. He was not yet 30, and he was a has-been. He returned to England, to a tax exile situation that was a bureaucratic nightmare. The millions he had supposedly earned were gone, swallowed by D. Anthony, by the IRS, by the sheer cost of maintaining the illusion of stardom. He was left with his addiction, his crumbling marriage, and a reputation as difficult. The phone stopped ringing. The stadiums went silent. After a decade of deafening noise, the sudden quiet was unbearable. It was in this vacuum that the real darkness settled in. Without the structure of the tour, without the adrenaline of the stage, Steve was left alone with his demons. The cocaine wasn't fuel anymore. It was the only thing that made him feel like he existed. He began to sell off his assets. The cars went. The expensive guitars went. He was liquidating his past to pay for his numbness. He tried to form new bands. He formed the All-Stars. He tried a Small Faces reunion in the late 70s. But the magic was elusive. The chemistry wasn't there. The industry had moved on to punk rock. Ironically, the punks loved Steve Marriott, the Sex Pistols, the Clash. They worshipped the Small Faces. They saw Steve as the original punk, the working-class hero with the attitude. Steve could have ridden this wave. He could have reinvented himself as the elder statesman of punk, but he was too bitter, too drug-addled to see the opportunity. He looked at the punks and saw amateurs. He rejected their homage. He retreated further into the pubs, into the blues, into the past. The 1980s were a wasteland. This was the lost decade. Steve became a nomad, moving between small cottages, cheap flats, and friends' sofas. He played anywhere that would pay him in cash. He played working men's clubs. He played dingy bars in Germany. He played to 50 people who were more interested in their beer than the legend on stage. It was a humiliation for a man who had conquered Shea Stadium. But Steve played every gig as if it were the Fillmore. He screamed just as loud for the 50 drunks as he did for the 20,000 fans. It was a matter of pride. In these small, smoke-filled rooms, he would often abandon the technology altogether. He would step off the low stage, walk into the middle of the crowd, and put down the microphone. Veins bulging, eyes wild, he would sing unplugged before it was a trend, using the sheer raw power of his voice to drown out the clatter of beer glasses and the chatter of the bar. He didn't need electricity to be electric. It was a magnificent, tragic display of a lion roaring in a cage. It was the only thing he had left. The physical toll was becoming visible. His face, once the definition of boyish good looks, was gaunt and lined. His teeth were suffering. His liver was swollen. He was burning the candle at both ends and then taking a blowtorch to the middle. Yet, in these dark years, there were moments of brilliance. When he was sober, when the mood was right, he could still touch God. He would sit at a piano in a smoky pub and sing a Ray Charles cover with such heartbreaking vulnerability that the entire room would weep. These were the glimpses of the man inside the monster, the soul that was slowly being suffocated by the lifestyle. He was a man running from a fire that was already burning inside him. He moved from relationship to relationship, leaving a trail of chaos and broken hearts. He was looking for a savior, a woman who could fix him, a manager who wouldn't rob him, a band that would understand him. But he was looking in the bottom of a bottle. He was looking in a mirror covered in white powder. As the 80s drew to a close, the narrative of the fallen idol was firmly established. The industry viewed him as a tragedy, a cautionary tale. Don't end up like Steve Marriott, managers would tell their young clients. He was the ghost at the feast. But Steve wasn't dead yet. He was fighting. He was writing songs. He was scraping by. He was a survivor, a cockroach in the nuclear winter of his own making. He believed with a desperate, delusional intensity that he had one more comeback in him, one more hit, one more time at the top. This belief was the oxygen that kept the ember alive, the ember that would eventually ignite the final inferno. To survive this wasteland, he formed a new band, Packet of Three, a crude reference to a pack of condoms. It was a stripped-down unit meant for the factory floor. No lasers, no jets, just raw noise. But the humiliation was physical. The man who once flew in private planes was now his own roadie, hauling heavy amplifiers into battered vans in the driving rain. When the cash flow dried up completely, the final indignity occurred. He was forced to sell his beloved guitars, the very tools of his soul, just to pay the rent. He was selling pieces of himself to survive. The poverty wasn't just a lack of luxury, it was a degradation of survival. When he was living in California, the man who had generated millions for the music industry was reduced to walking the streets of Santa Cruz, collecting empty glass bottles to return for nickel deposits just to buy food. Back in England, it got worse. There were days when the cupboards were so bare, he would sneak into local farm fields at dawn to steal potatoes and cabbages. He was eating stolen vegetables while his songs were playing on classic rock radio stations around the world. Steve Marriott, the man who had written All or Nothing, was now living the nothing. To numb this resentment, the alcohol consumption shifted from rock and roll excess to maintenance alcoholism. In the 70s, he drank to celebrate. In the 80s, he drank to forget. The brandy and vodka became his primary caloric intake. He was drinking to silence the voice in his head that asked, "What happened?" He was drinking to quell the anxiety of the unpaid bills. He was drinking to tolerate the endless grinding mediocrity of the circuit. The alcohol began to alter his personality. The charming, cheeky chappie of the 60s was replaced by a volatile, paranoid figure. He could be incredibly generous one moment, giving the coat off his back to a stranger, and terrifyingly violent the next, flipping tables and throwing punches over a perceived slight. He was becoming a liability. Promoters were wary of booking him. Other musicians were wary of playing with him. He was burning bridges faster than he could build them. Despite the chaos, this talent remained stubbornly, frustratingly intact. That was the tragedy of the 80s. If he had lost his voice, he could have retired with dignity. But the voice was still there. It was deeper now, ravaged by smoke and whiskey. But it had acquired a new texture, a gravelly, soulful pain that was impossible to fake. When he sang Black Coffee or Tin Soldier in a half-empty club in Putney, it wasn't nostalgia. It was an exorcism. He sang with the desperation of a man clinging to a wreckage. He was arguably singing better than he ever had, but he was doing it in a vacuum. The industry had stopped listening. They saw him as a has-been, a relic to be pitied but not employed. He tried to diversify. He put together a funk and soul review, adding brass sections and backing singers, trying to recreate the stacked sound he loved. It was musically brilliant, but commercially disastrous. It cost more to put on the road than it earned. He was bleeding money he didn't have to fund an artistic vision nobody wanted to buy. He was like a captain insisting on sailing a galleon in an age of speedboats. He refused to adapt to the synthesizer-driven pop of the 80s. He hated drum machines. He hated sequencers. He viewed them as soulless toys. He clung to his Telecaster and his Hammond organ like religious artifacts, preaching the gospel of analog truth to a digital world that had stopped caring. His personal life during this decade was a series of scorched earth campaigns. Marriages collapsed under the weight of his addiction and his erratic behavior. He was a man who demanded absolute loyalty but gave none in return. He was searching for a mother figure, a manager, and a lover, all rolled into one, someone who could organize his chaos, soothe his ego, and fix his life. But he was impossible to fix. He would sabotage any stability he found. If a relationship was going well, he would destroy it, subconsciously believing he didn't deserve happiness. He was comfortable only in crisis. Chaos was the only environment he understood. By the late 80s, Steve was living in a small cottage in Essex, a rural retreat that should have been idyllic, but was in reality a damp, clutter-filled bunker. He was surrounded by the debris of his career, gold records stacked against peeling wallpaper, flight cases acting as furniture. He was isolating himself. He spent days tinkering with old recording equipment, making demos that went nowhere. He became a familiar figure in the local village pubs, not as the international rock star, but as the local drunk who told tall tales about the old days. The locals liked him. He was funny, unpretentious, and bought rounds when he had money. But they saw the sadness in his eyes. They saw a man waiting for a train that had already left the station. The physical toll was becoming undeniable. He was thin, his skin gray from nicotine and lack of sunlight. His liver was under constant assault. His teeth, once part of that dazzling face smile, were neglected. He looked older than his 40 years. He looked like a man who had lived 3 lifetimes in fast forward. Yet, the delusion of the comeback persisted. It was the carrot that kept him moving. He was always one phone call away from the big time, one more album, one more tour. He believed that justice would eventually be served, that the world would remember who Steve Marriott was, and then miraculously the phone did ring. It wasn't a promoter or a manager, it was an old friend, or rather, an old rival, Peter Frampton. Frampton had had his own journey. After leaving Humble Pie, he had become the biggest pop star on the planet with Frampton Comes Alive, only to suffer his own crash and burn in the late 70s. By 1990, Frampton was rebuilding his career, looking for authenticity, looking to reconnect with his roots. He remembered the chemistry. He remembered the fire of the early Humble Pie days. He reached out to Steve. For Steve, this call was not just a professional opportunity. It was a vindication. It was proof that he hadn't been crazy all these years. Frampton, the successful one, the sensible one, wanted him. It validated his entire existence. The bitterness that had crusted over his heart began to crack. Maybe he wasn't finished. Maybe the story had a third act. They agreed to meet. Steve flew to Los Angeles in early 1991. The contrast between his squalid cottage in Essex and the sunny, manicured wealth of L.A. was jarring. But Steve didn't care. He was back in the game. He walked into the rehearsal room with Frampton, and the years melted away. They played. The sound, that specific grinding, heavy interplay of guitar and organ, the lockstep rhythm, was still there. It was muscle memory. Frampton was shocked. Steve's voice was ragged, yes, but the power was undiminished. If anything, the years of suffering had added a weight to it that was terrifying. They wrote songs, they made plans, a new album, a world tour, money, real money. Not cash in hand at a pub, but advances, royalties, merchandise. Steve saw the exit door opening. He saw a way out of the poverty, out of the humiliation. He called his friends back in England, manic with excitement. "I've done it," he told them. "We're getting the band back together. It's going to be huge." But there was a shadow hanging over this reunion. Frampton, sober and professional, saw the state Steve was in. He saw the drinking. He saw the chain smoking. He saw the erratic bursts of energy followed by the slumps. He knew that for this to work, Steve had to be functional. There were conditions. Steve had to hold it together. Steve, in his desperation, agreed to everything. He would have promised to fly to the moon to secure this deal. He was terrified of blowing it, which, perversely, made him drink more to calm the fear. He flew back to London on April 19th, 1991, carrying a cassette tape of the new demos in his pocket. On that flight home, Steve was seated in business class. He was sipping champagne at 30,000 feet, surrounded by the golden light of the sunset above the clouds. He was celebrating. He felt like a star again. The luxury of that cabin, the bubbles in the glass, the feeling of ascent. It was a sharp contrast to the horror to come. He didn't know that within 12 hours, he would trade that pristine high-altitude air for the choking toxic smoke of a damp cottage on the ground. The crash from that champagne high to the carbonized reality of the floorboards would be the steepest fall of his life. He was a man suspended between two worlds. Behind him lay the wreckage of the 80s, the poverty, the failed marriages, the small pubs. Ahead of him lay the 90s, redemption, wealth, and a return to the stadiums. He was walking a tightrope over an abyss, and he was tired. He was so incredibly tired. The jet lag from the flight was hammering his circadian rhythms. The adrenaline of the LA trip was wearing off, leaving a vacuum that demanded to be filled. He landed at Heathrow and made his way back to Essex. He didn't go straight home. He stopped at a restaurant with his wife, Tony. But the atmosphere was tense. He was wired, manic, talking a mile a minute about the future. He drank wine. He drank brandy. He was celebrating, he told himself. He was preloading for the sleep he desperately needed. The prince of poverty was about to abdicate. The king was returning. He arrived at his cottage late that night. The house was cold. It smelled of old smoke and damp. It was the physical manifestation of the life he was leaving behind. He was alone. Tony had stayed elsewhere after an argument, a common occurrence in their volatile relationship. He was the master of his domain, a king in a castle of straw. He checked his messages. He looked at his gold records. He poured another drink, a large brandy, to settle the nerves, to stop the spinning in his head. He sat in the quiet of the 16th century house. The silence of the countryside was heavy after the noise of Los Angeles. He felt the weight of the years dropping off him, but also the physical exhaustion crashing down. He needed to sleep. He needed to be fresh for tomorrow. Tomorrow was the start of the rest of his life. He took the Valium, just a few to help him drift off. A chemical sunset to end the day. He climbed the narrow stairs to the bedroom. It was a small room cluttered with books, clothes, and newspapers. He crawled into bed fully clothed. The fatigue was a physical weight, pressing him into the mattress. The combination of the alcohol and the pills began to shut down the lighting grid of his brain, sector by sector. The anxiety faded. The ambition faded. The anger faded. There was just the warm, dark, fuzzy embrace of the sedative. He reached for his cigarettes. It was a reflex action, hardwired into his nervous system after 30 years of smoking. He lit a Benson and Hedges. He took a drag. The cherry glowed orange in the dark. He exhaled. His eyelids were heavy. Gravity was pulling him down. The hand holding the cigarette relaxed. The muscles lost their tension. The fingers uncurled. The cigarette fell. It didn't make a sound when it hit the sheets. It was a tiny event, a microscopic transfer of thermal energy. But in that silent, dark room surrounded by the dry timber of history and the flammable debris of a chaotic life, it was the start of the final act. The future he had just secured was about to be consumed by the past he couldn't escape. The cruelty of the timing was absolute. He didn't die during the years of failure. He died at the precise moment of his salvation. He had landed at Heathrow only hours before the fire started. The ink on the mental contract with Frampton wasn't even dry. Fate had handed him a winning lottery ticket, and he had used it to light the fuse of his own destruction. The match had been struck 44 years ago in East London. Now the fuse had finally burned down to the powder keg. The chemistry of the tragedy was now fully active. While the cigarette began its slow, malignant work on the surface of the bedsheets, a far more complex and devastating reaction was taking place inside the body of Steve Marriott. A man who spent his life dodging bottles failed to survive a domestic accident, not because of the fire, but because of what was in his bloodstream. The cocktail he had ingested was not merely a recreational indulgence. It was a physiological padlock. The brandy had entered his system first. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. In the quantities Steve consumed, likely conditioned by years of high tolerance, it acted as a sedative, slowing down brain function, dulling the senses, and lowering the heart rate. But alcohol alone, even in significant amounts, rarely incapacitates a seasoned drinker to the point of total paralysis in the face of mortal danger. The fatal variable was the Valium. Diazepam, the active ingredient, binds to the GABA receptors in the brain, essentially telling the neurons to stop firing. It creates a state of artificial calm, a chemical blanket that smothers anxiety. When alcohol and Valium are combined, they do not simply add to each other's effects, they multiply them. This is known as potentiation. The liver, tasked with metabolizing both substances, becomes overwhelmed. It prioritizes the alcohol, leaving the Valium to circulate in the blood for longer and at higher concentrations. The result is a profound suppression of the reticular activating system, the part of the brainstem responsible for regulating wakefulness and the transition between sleep and consciousness. Steve Marriott wasn't just asleep. He was in a chemically induced twilight zone that bordered on anesthesia. His breathing would have been shallow, his pulse slow, his sensory threshold raised to a dangerous level. He was a fortress, with the guards drugged and the gates welded shut. Meanwhile, on the bed, the physics of combustion were proceeding with terrifying patience. A cigarette dropped on cotton sheets does not typically erupt into a blaze immediately. It smolders. This is the incipient phase of a fire, the most treacherous period because it is silent. The glowing cherry of the tobacco burned at a temperature of around 400 to 600 degrees Celsius, hot enough to decompose the fabric of the bedding. The cotton charred, turning black, eating outwards in a slow, expanding ring. For minutes, perhaps 10, perhaps 20, there was no flame. There was only heat and smoke. But this was not the clean wood smoke of a campfire. This was the toxic off-gassing of synthetic materials. The mattress likely contained polyurethane foam, a standard material in the 20th century that, when heated, behaves like solid petrol. As the heat from the smoldering sheets penetrated deeper into the mattress, the foam began to break down. It released a cocktail of gases, carbon monoxide, hydrogen cyanide, and acrolein. Carbon monoxide is the silent assassin of the fire world. Colorless, odorless, and tasteless, it binds to hemoglobin in the blood with an affinity 200 times greater than oxygen. Even as Steve lay breathing in the darkness, the oxygen in his blood was being replaced by poison. This gas does not wake you up. It puts you deeper to sleep. It causes confusion, lethargy, and eventually unconsciousness. It was a second layer of sedation applied externally, reinforcing the chemical cage he had built internally. The room began to fill with smoke. In a small thatched cottage with low ceilings and small windows, the volume of air is limited. The smoke would have risen to the ceiling, banked, and then begun to lower like a descending curtain. It was a hot, oily smoke, thick with soot and unburned particulates. It obscured the ceiling beams, then the tops of the wardrobe, then the pictures on the walls. It swallowed the room in a choking gray haze, blotting out the moonlight. At some critical point, the smoldering transitioned to open flame. The heat accumulating in the mattress reached the auto-ignition temperature of the fabric or the foam. A tongue of orange fire would have flickered into life. Once the flame appeared, the dynamics of the room changed instantly. The temperature spiked. The fire began to consume the oxygen greedily, creating a convection current that pulled fresh air from under the door and fed the blaze. The curtains, heavy and dry, were just a few feet away. The clutter on the floor, the newspapers, the clothes, the books, acted as stepping stones for the fire. The sound would have changed. The silence was broken by the crackle of burning fabric, the pop of wood as the moisture inside boiled and expanded, and the low roar of the draft. The smoke alarm, sensing the particulate matter, began to scream. Its piercing, high-decibel shriek was designed to cut through the deepest REM sleep. It battered the walls of the small cottage. Then, the nightmare scenario became reality. Steve Marriott woke up. The forensic evidence found by the firefighters, the location of his body on the floor, tells us that the chemical lock was not absolute. The survival instinct, the primal lizard brain that sits beneath the layers of consciousness, detected the threat. Perhaps it was the heat which was now searing. Perhaps it was the sound of the alarm. Perhaps it was the choking sensation of the smoke. Whatever the trigger, a signal forced its way through the fog of Valium and brandy. Danger, fire, run. He opened his eyes, but he didn't see the familiar chaotic comfort of his bedroom. He saw hell. The room was glowing orange. The heat was physical, a heavy weight pressing down on him. The air was gone, replaced by a scorching soup of toxins. He tried to move. The paralysis was total. The brain issued the command to the muscles, get up, jump, run. But the transmission was garbled. The benzodiazepines had relaxed his skeletal muscles to the point of flaccidity. His coordination was shattered. The carbon monoxide had already begun to starve his brain of the oxygen needed to process complex motor functions. He wasn't the agile frontman who could leap off drum risers anymore. He was a man wading through invisible concrete. He managed to roll off the bed. He hit the floor. He knew the layout of his own home. The door was just to his right. But the hypoxia was already scrambling his internal compass. In the thick, choking darkness, he made a fatal error. He didn't crawl right toward the exit. He crawled left. He pulled himself not into the hallway, but into a small airing cupboard. He was trapped in a confined space within a burning box. He didn't die in the fire. He died in the dark confusion of that cupboard, unable to correct the last mistake of his life. It was a claustrophobic, terrifying end for a man who had lived his life on wide-open stages. He was a prisoner in his own skin, fully aware that the walls were closing in, but unable to turn the key. The smoke was the true killer. As he gasped for air on the floor, he inhaled the superheated toxins from the burning mattress. The hydrogen cyanide acted instantly, interfering with the body's ability to use oxygen at the cellular level. It was a chemical suffocation. His lungs burned, his throat closed up. The coughing reflex, usually violent and protective, was suppressed by the drugs. He was drowning in dry air. The timeline of this struggle was likely short, seconds, perhaps a minute. But in the subjective experience of the victim, it must have felt like an eternity. The realization of what was happening, the irony of it, must have been the final crushing thought. He had just secured his future. He had just fixed the mistake of the last 20 years. He was Steve Marriott, the survivor. He wasn't supposed to die like this, alone on the floor, defeated by a mattress and a pill. As the oxygen levels in his blood plummeted, consciousness began to flicker and fade. The terror, the pain, the regret, it all washed away under the gray tide of hypoxia. He stopped struggling. He lay still on the floorboards, curled in a fetal position, a final instinctive posture of protection. The roar of the fire grew louder, drowning out the alarm, drowning out the silence of the night. The flames jumped from the bed to the curtains, from the curtains to the ancient dry timber of the roof. The 16th century cottage, dried timber and thatch, surrendered instantly to the flames. It became a chimney. Outside the fog was thick. The village of Arkesden slept. The thick walls of the cottage insulated the sound. No one heard the alarm. No one heard the crash of falling timber. The fire raged in isolation, a private apocalypse contained within four walls. It was a perfect storm of bad luck. The isolation of the location, the timing of the night, the weather conditions, and the internal state of the victim. By the time the passing motorist saw the glow, the structural integrity of the house was failing. The roof, heavy with thatch, a material that burns with intense, stubborn heat, collapsed inwards. It fell into the bedroom, burying the scene in a tomb of burning debris. The floorboards gave way. The destruction was total. The fire didn't just kill Steve Marriott, it erased the evidence of his struggle. It turned the scene into a chaotic ruin of charcoal and ash. When the fire brigade arrived, the battle was not to save a life, but to prevent the fire from spreading. They poured water onto the shell of the building, the steam mixed with the smoke, creating a ghostly shroud over the site. It took hours for the heat to subside enough for them to enter. They didn't know who was inside. They didn't know they were walking into the final resting place of a legend. They were just looking for a body. The discovery was grim. The first firefighter to enter the room found a form that was stiff and unyielding, a tragic carbonized sculpture. The brutality of the fire was absolute. It hadn't just killed him, it had erased him. This was the man known to the world as the Face, the Mod icon who had defined a generation's style. Now there was no face left. The police couldn't use visual confirmation. They had to rely on dental records to identify the rock legend. The flames had reduced a cultural icon to a medical chart. The police began their work. They cordoned off the lane. They took statements. They found the car outside, confirming that Steve Marriott had returned home. They pieced together the timeline. But the true story of those final moments, the chemical cage, the waking nightmare, the desperate failed crawl, was written only in the forensic details, in the toxicology report that would come later, and in the position of the body that told a story of a fight lost in the dark. The aftermath of the fire was a slow, grim procession of realization. As Saturday morning broke over Essex, the news began to filter out, not as a confirmed fact, but as a terrified whisper. The phone lines between London and Los Angeles started to buzz. Peter Frampton, still high on the adrenaline of their reunion, was waiting for a call from Steve to confirm the next steps. Instead, he received a call that shattered the future they had just built. The initial reports were confused. A fire, a body identification pending. But everyone who knew Steve, who knew the chaos of his life and the tinderbox he lived in, felt the cold weight of certainty. When the confirmation finally came, via the dental records that reduced a cultural icon to a medical chart, the reaction was not the hysterical grief of a sudden young death like Hendrix or Joplin. It was a deeper, wearier sorrow. It was the heavy sigh of an industry that had watched a slow-motion car crash for 20 years and done nothing to stop it. The tragedy wasn't just that he died, it was that his death felt inevitable. It was the final brutal punchline to the joke of the Prince of Poverty. The investigation was clinical. The coroner recorded a verdict of accidental death, a mundane domestic horror stripped of any rock and roll romance. A man, a pill, a cigarette, a fire. In death, Steve Marriott was just a victim of a household accident. The funeral at Harlow Crematorium was a final act of loneliness. Old friends like Jerry Shirley and Ronnie Wood arrived late due to traffic, left to stare at a filled grave in the pouring rain. The world outside barely noticed. On MTV, the news of his death was a mere scrolling ticker beneath a New Kids on the Block feature. The industry that had replaced his raw soul with manufactured pop didn't even have the decency to pause the commercial break. Inside the chapel, All or Nothing played. It was a fatal prophecy fulfilled. He had gone for it all and was left with ash. To make matters worse, he died intestate. There was no secret fortune, only a labyrinth of debt and a burnt-out house. He left his family to squabble over scraps. A messy end to a messy life. Yet the fire that destroyed his body cauterized his legacy. Just as he died believing he was a failure, a new generation in Britain, Oasis, Blur, Paul Weller, was rising, citing him as their titan. He was the missing link between Otis Redding and Johnny Rotten, the bridge between soul and punk. He died a has-been, only to immediately become the Godfather of Mod, the seed for the entire Britpop explosion. The appreciation has always arrived too late. The what if remains haunting. The comeback with Frampton was days away. A return to stadiums was within reach. That timeline was incinerated by a single mistake. But the fire couldn't touch the music. On Tin Soldier, the lyric, "I want to jump into your fire," is chilling, but the delivery is immortal. The cottage is gone, the smoke has cleared, but the voice remains, screaming from the dark, defiant and eternal.